Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this IMarEST Stanley Gray Lecture to be delivered by Professor James Crabbe on coral reefs in their international year. But before we start, we have one or two sort of housekeeping things to get through. The first thing is for me to introduce me to you so that you know why I'm up here helping James Crabbe through his ordeal. And it's simply that I am Chris Hodge and I am the immediate past president of the Institute, which means I fell from grace about just under a month ago, and I'm on my way down now into obscurity, so this is perhaps one of the last times I'll be able to stand here like this and talk to you. So the first thing is health and safety. Obviously we need to know how to leave the building in an emergency, and please follow the green exit signs. I can give you a clue. You don't go that way, you go that way. And you go down the stairs and you meet, I can tell you, on the steps to Wakefield Gardens, which is near to Tower Hill Tube Station. The other thing I want you to know, and it's very important, is that you are not alone. This lecture is being live streamed to a further 100 people. So we formed together quite an audience. What it does mean, when we get to questions, we'll be quite firm on you, the questioners, waiting to receive a microphone such that we deliver the best possible live streamed experience. Okay, so when we get to that bit, that's what we're going to do. Now, the next thing is the background about the lecture. The IMarEST Stanley Gray Lectures and the annual Stanley Gray Awards are named in memory of Stanley Gray, who was the Chief Mechanical Engineer for, I think, Lloyd's Register at the Port Directorate of Basra during the 1950s and 60s. When he died in 1973, he left half of his estate to be held by the Institute in trust to create the Stanley Gray Fund. He expressed the wish that the money should be awarded via a scholarship or prize to wherever the Institute saw distinction in marine engineering. Now, following due process, that's been extended to cover marine science and technology. And we now have, amongst the prizes and awards, we also have this series of Stanley Gray Prestige Lectures, which started in 2002, and that is one of the ways we mark his generosity and patronage of the Institute. And so here we are tonight, and here is Professor Crabbe. Now, you probably don't need to know anything about Professor Crabbe, because he is certainly eminent. But I'll read you the first few lines of his CV, which if I read it in full, would probably take all the time we have for this lecture. So I'll be brief. Just imagine expanding this by a factor of about 8. James is an emeritus professor of biochemistry, a supernumerary fellow of Wolfson College, Oxford University, and honorary professor at Changchun University of Science and Technology in China. From 2014 to 2017, he was a senior research associate in the Department of Zoology, Oxford University. He is a vice president and council member of the IMarEST and a trustee and member of the management committee of the Guild of Benevolence. He is chair of the education committee of the International Society for Reef Studies and committee member of the International Year of the Reef 2018. So given the subject that he has chosen to talk to us about at this prestige lecture, we know we're going to have a great time, and we're going to hear from someone who knows all that he needs to know about the subject, and I encourage you to prove that in the questions when we get to the end. James is now going to kick me on his way up. James Crabbe.
Chris, thanks for that great, I think, introduction. Can I ask if you can hear me? Yep, and welcome not only to the audience here, but to our wonderful people listening from distant shores. Now, this is why I'm here. 2018 is the third International Year of the Reef, and one of the things I'm going to be talking about is what is the state of the reefs? Now, just giving you one or two flavors and some of the things that you can do to get involved. So I've been working on reefs since about 2000 in various places, the University of Bedfordshire, delighted to see Les here, and other colleagues from my various pasts and presents. So let's start off underwater.
For thousands of years, the world's coral reefs have fed us, protected us, sustained life in the world's oceans, and provided life-changing medicines. But time is running out. If we don't act now, every coral reef in the world could be gone within our lifetime. Help turn the tide. The year of the reef. Get involved.
So that's the problem. Let's look at some of the potential issues, and then we'll look at some of the ways that it might be being solved. Now, it might be surprising that here's somebody who works on coral reefs giving the Stanley Gray Lecture, because as Chris said, he was the chief mechanical engineer at the Port Directorate of Basra during the 50s and 60s. And I thought I'd show you, first of all, a very glossy postcard of Basra at the time, and then a postcard of a real photograph taken at that time. But actually, you can see from the map, Basra is at the very, very north western end of the Persian Gulf. And there are corals in the Persian Gulf. It's the most extreme climate endured by reef-building corals anywhere in the world, but it is still home to 40 species of reef-building, which we call Scleractinia corals. One thing that I think it's very useful to remember is that scuba diving, and a lot of the research is done on coral reefs by scuba diving, only comes about because of the invention of the regulator by Jacques Cousteau and his colleague Gagnon in the 1940s. The top left-hand picture there shows you what it used to be like before Cousteau and Gagnon developed the regulator. Of course, health and safety in those days was something different. There's one of his colleagues, Dumas, gathering gorgonians 100 feet down, 33 meters down. And you just don't do that these days without an awful lot of health and safety training. That's one of the very first colour pictures, it's from a book that I've got, one of the very first colour pictures of corals that were taken underwater. Now, as the video told you, lots of things are going wrong. This was a report from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization last year. The world's coral reefs are in grave danger of dying out completely by the mid-century, this century, and consequences could be severe for millions of people. And what I'd like to emphasize is that it's not just the ecosystems, it's the millions of people that are dependent upon them. Only just over a month ago, the Prince of Wales gave a big presentation in London about the global call to action to save coral reefs from a complete international global collapse. He also showed the importance of plastics at that time. Next week in the city we have the meeting of the heads of Commonwealth, and they're also going to find out at least something about the importance of this third International Year of the Reef. Now, those of you who came to last year's Stanley Gray lecture by Alex Rogers would have found out something about the deep ocean and mesophotic reefs. I'll have a little more to say about them at the end. I'm going to talk about the top bit, the top left-hand corner bit, which is very much in the photic zone. And I would recommend also his lecture is available on the web, and it would be very interesting, I think, if you haven't seen it, to have a look at that as well. So what do we mean by stony corals? Here I've got two pictures. The one on the right is of what we call a branching coral. It's an Acropora species. On the left-hand side, I've got a photograph I took, and I'm going to ask you a question, so just have your mental sort of abilities there. Both of them are hard corals, and both of them are related to sea anemones, and they both contain algae, which we call zooxanthellae, and it's the algae that are a symbiotic relationship with the little polyps and are important for all the biochemistry, all the pathways whereby sunlight is used to convert the carbon dioxide in the seawater, dissolved in the seawater, into carbonate skeletons. My question, where do you think I took the picture on the left? It's the northernmost coral reefs in the world. Where might that be? Sorry? You got it in one. Absolutely right. Fantastic. That was on the reefs of Bermuda. Now, Bermuda is a very interesting location. It's only there because of the Gulf Stream. The corals there are almost one type of coral. They're all a massive type of coral, as you can see there. And you could speculate that as global warming is going to take over, a lot of the species will not be surviving, and therefore we're going to have the sort of monospecific environment for coral reefs that you can see in Bermuda. That's just a speculation, but I'd like you to think about that as we go through the talk. Coral animals are in a symbiotic relationship with the zooxanthellae, the little plant cells that you can see in this photograph as the little brown dots, and it's the colors. Most of the corals contain the colors mostly in the zooxanthellae. The corals are very, very important. The hard corals are very, very important at providing the right environment for this rich ecosystem. Here's the rough food web. You've got top predators, you've got sharks, you've got dolphins, going right down to smaller creatures. You've got invertebrates there, you've got jellyfish. You've got a very complex ecosystem. And often, as I'm sure you know, it's been compared to the rainforest. One of the things I'd like to emphasize is the connectivity. You cannot consider coral reefs without also considering the other ecosystems in the location. So at the bottom left there, that's our coral reef. Then we have a seagrass bed. At the top, we have a mangrove forest leading onto a real terrestrial forest just by the coastline. These ecosystems are intimately linked. For example, if you are a coral reef fish and you spawn on the coral reef, your young fish, your offspring, will often go through the seagrass beds to grow up in the mangrove swamps for protection. So the seagrass beds and the mangrove forests are very important in the generation of adult fish. They swim back and then they spawn again on the coral reefs. As soon as you get rid of one of those ecosystems, the whole connectivity breaks down. So you can't really just consider coral reefs on their own. They're also very, very important financially. This just shows you some of the economic benefits for ecosystem services, for coral reefs. The largest there is recreation and tourism, but there are an awful lot of others that run it pretty close. Maintenance of genetic diversity, waste treatment, a lot of biological control, aesthetics, of course, very important, food, raw materials. Lots of dollars that you need to be aware of if you're going to produce arguments for a political solution. I'm just going to describe 4 broad threats to coral reefs. Coastal development. For any of you, I spend quite a lot of time in China. Hainan, I don't know if anybody's been to Hainan. That's the sort of tropical island. And the coastal development means that they have destroyed most of the coral reefs around Hainan Island. Construction materials, building on reefs and so on. Marine pollution, I showed you the picture of the Persian Gulf. There's an awful lot of marine pollution as well as coastal development, of course, in the Persian Gulf. Overexploitation and destructive fishing. Overfishing has been one of the biggest nightmares, I think, to the preservation of coral reefs. And destructive fishing, blast fishing, and I have been underwater when somebody threw a bomb in the water. I don't recommend it. It was a sobering experience. Fortunately, I was just about far enough away, but the whole of the reef that I and my colleagues had been looking at was completely smashed. That was in Indonesia. You'll notice that I haven't put climate change there. Climate change will come a bit later. And it's interesting if we look at this 1770s map of the Florida Keys from a publication late last year, because in the 1770s, there was a lot of very good mapping and a lot of very good analysis of the reef systems in this area. We can compare the reefs that were in the 1770s to the reefs now. And what is interesting is that many of the offshore reefs are still there in Florida. The issue comes with the nearshore reefs. Many of them have been completely demolished by coastal development and dredging. So, those are still very, very important as a destructive problem. Climate change, we've seen global temperatures increase, sea level rise, very important, and ocean acidification. These are moderately recent figures. These really are serious problems for all marine environments, particularly for coral reefs. Another issue is the increase in hurricane intensity. As sea surface temperatures go up, hurricanes get their energy from warm water. And so what we can see from this bottom slide here is that the higher intensity of hurricanes, the category 4 and 5 hurricanes, are increasing over this period of time because the waters are getting warmer. Now, you might think that what we're talking about as climate change is fairly recent. Not at all. And these figures were instrumental in realizing that climate change was going to happen. The first, most important one was Joseph Fourier, a Frenchman who managed to escape the guillotine 4 times, realized that Earth's atmosphere acts like a bell jar. He was a very important person. You might know him. He developed the mathematics that anybody who's been for an MRI scan will have used, or rather the analysis will have used. So Fourier analysis, absolutely essential in medicine as well as in climatology. John Tyndall, an Englishman in the 1860s, recognized the greenhouse effect and identified the relative forcing values of different greenhouse gases. And perhaps the most important was the Nobel Prize winner Sven Arrhenius in 1895, who realized not only that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gives a hothouse effect, but his calculations were remarkably accurate in showing the relationship between the gases and between the warming. What he didn't realize was that it was going to happen so quickly. So he thought that the coasts of Sweden would become beaches, but he didn't realize it would happen quite so quickly. So lots of meteorological processes influencing tropical marine life. I've just put some of them on that slide. I've referred to the irradiation, the warming of the warm waters. One thing I'd like to comment on briefly is the influence of atmospheric CO2 on calcium carbonate saturation and the pH. pH of oceans is certainly changing, and there was a very recent paper published in Nature just a few weeks ago, very important experiment. It was the first experiment actually using real seawater in a large-scale study to show that carbon dioxide addition to coral reef water suppresses net community calcification. And what that means is that corals, of course, are made up of calcium carbonate, and this was a very important study that near future reductions in, it's a particular type of carbonate, it's called aragonite, in the saturation state will compromise the ecosystem function of coral reefs. So a very important study there. Coral bleaching. Anybody seen the film Finding Nemo? Okay, so you may remember when the ray was swimming with the little nursery fish over the reefs, this wonderful color of the reefs. What happens, as I implied, in bleaching is that you lose those little colored algal cells because corals only survive in a very narrow temperature range. So when the corals get too cold, or mostly what we're concerned about is too warm, then they turn completely white. And I'm going to show you a video now from a very important film called Chasing Coral, which describes that, I think, very, very powerfully.
The idea is to get as many shots as we can in as many positions of as many pieces of coral as we can, and to repeat that every single day.
Imagine your body temperature rises 1 degree centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade. Over a period of time, that would be fatal. And that's the seriousness of the issue when you look at it in terms of the ocean.
You forget what it looked like at the beginning. And some days when you go back, it's dead as far as you can see. I thought we would find bleaching. I thought we would capture it. But I don't think I ever prepared myself or thought we were going to see this.
The warming trends on the planet are so rapid and are affecting the global patterns of temperature in the ocean so profoundly that coral reefs will not be able to keep up, they will not be able to adapt, and we will see the eradication of an entire ecosystem in our lifespan.
Everything on our planet is connected. What we're doing is pulling out the card called coral reefs from this house of cards. And the real fear is that we'll take out enough of those cards where the whole thing will just simply collapse.
Do we need forests? Do we need trees? Do we need reefs? Or can we just sort of live in the ashes of all of that?
Just happening in one place. It's happening all over the world, as shown by the red dots on this particular source of bleaching information from Reef Base. Now, in 2009, nearly 10 years ago, I and over 30 other scientists from around the world, some of whom are here with us this afternoon, got together under the chairmanship of Sir David Attenborough at the Royal Society to produce a statement on the coral reef crisis working group for the meeting of the Conference of the Parties. You may remember it in Copenhagen. And we spent a lot of time and not a little amount of energy and angst in producing the right wording, which over 30 international scientists could agree on. You know, that's hard going. But we did it. And basically, we're more or less in the same place as we were then. And that's the problem. Here's one example. This is on the reefs at the Gulf of Myanmar, between India and Sri Lanka. 2 to 3 degrees in sea surface temperatures killed 16% of the corals in October 2016. I mention that because it wasn't quite as made popular as this bleaching, which was on the largest barrier reef in the world, in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, which bleached both in 2016 and 2017, and the red dots showed the most severe bleaching, and you can see it is a significant, very significant amount of the reef that bleached there. So I'm going to refer to that towards the end of the talk and look at how what might be one of the potential ways forward for that. But before I talk about the Great Barrier Reefs, I'm going to look at another area, particularly in the Caribbean. I've been working quite a lot in Jamaica on the reefs around Jamaica, and Jamaican reefs provide about $230 million US dollars to Jamaican GDP, and an awful lot of jobs in Jamaica depend on coral reef health, and about 350,000 visitors directly observed the coral reef ecosystems in the last year or so. I've been working on the north coast outside of Discovery Bay. Anybody been to Jamaica? Discovery Bay? Discovery Bay, yes? Excellent. So here we have a picture of Discovery Bay, and you might be interested to know, for those of you who don't know Jamaica, that tourism is not the major industry. In fact, it's bauxite, the ore of aluminium, and here's the bay, and this is one of the collecting hubs for the bauxite, which you can, the ore that you see. Now, on the video I showed you, there was Phil Dustan, and this was a picture he took of the reef crest in 1973. dominated by Acropora palmata, a particular branching coral, and it really was like a weed. You almost had to sort of, so people tell me who were diving there, you almost had to smash it to get down onto the reef slope and look at other corals. So this was exactly the same place where I took a photograph in 2005, and as you can see, all vanished. To be replaced mostly by macroalgae. The coral that you can see there is Orbicella, the major coral around these sort of reefs. The other reason I show you this picture, and you might have noticed from the film clip that I showed you, when you got bleaching of the reef, there were no fish above the bleached reefs. And what's happened here is that there are no large fish around the island. All the fish are about that size. And that's a serious problem, because once you lose the fish, all the predators go, and the whole food web that I showed you at the beginning just collapses. Now, why do you think we went from that wonderfully rich reef in the 1970s to this desert in 2005? And here's a quantitative illustration of that. In the 70s, up to over 70% coral cover at 10 meters, a massive drop in 1980. What do you think might have caused that? I've sort of given you a clue earlier on. Sorry? A hurricane, right, brilliant. It was indeed a hurricane. It was actually Hurricane Allen. There's a satellite image of the hurricane on the top right-hand photograph. The dotted line on the bottom left shows you the path of the hurricane just north of Discovery Bay. And this is a photograph taken almost where I took the photograph of Discovery Bay with the bauxite loading. The wave height was calculated to be 12 meters high of the waves breaking on the reef. So can you imagine the amount of wave energy under that tremendous energetic wave that's just smashing those corals up? So all those lovely branching corals just completely smashed. And certainly when I dive there, you can still see remnants of those smashed branching corals. So what we've done over quite a lot of years is apply computer modeling to coral growth data. There's an example. This is actually from a Barbados reef of an X-ray photograph, and you can see you can get banding patterns showing that you can get, just like in tree growth, tree ring growth, you can get similar sorts of indication for corals. And I and others have been looking at the influence of hurricanes on massive corals. That's not branching corals, these are those rounded corals, not only in Jamaica but also in Tobago and in Belize on the second largest barrier reef in the world, the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef. And certainly hurricanes are very important in limiting the recruitment, that is the reproduction and settlement of massive corals. So they don't just destroy branching corals, they also severely limit non-branching coral recruitment. That's just one of our papers there. Now, I mentioned 2005, and 2005 was a major event, not just in Jamaica, but throughout the Caribbean. It had the largest sea surface temperature anomaly, which is different from the norm, since records began. And this is a picture on the left-hand side showing what we call degree heating week values, which is an indication of sea surface temperature over a period of time. It's very simple. If you have 1 degree heating week, that means the temperature was raised 1 degree for 1 week. If you have 16 degree heating weeks, then it was raised either 16 degrees for 1 week or 1 degree for 16 weeks or somewhere in between. So it's a fairly sort of rough and ready, but it's a very useful figure when you're looking at this scale. And this was obtained, was a major study using satellite data with lots of people who were also doing ground truthing studies in the Caribbean too. And you can see that the major degree heating weeks there, 15, sometimes 16 plus degree heating weeks, were to the east of the Caribbean, particularly in the Windward Islands in the Lesser Antilles. And if we then look at where the hurricanes were that year, anybody remember a particular hurricane from 2005? Katrina? Okay, so pretty powerful. What was interesting, as I said earlier on, that the hurricanes get their energy from warm water, and of course the positive effect for the reefs, if you haven't already destroyed them, is that the water cools down, so you don't get the heating. So it's one of those lovely natural effects. And indeed, when we looked at 2005, we didn't get significant bleaching over the hurricane paths. But over the whole of the Caribbean, you can see there was a very good correlation between the mean amount of bleaching and the observed degree heating weeks. And this is important because it gives us a predictive tool on predicting mortality. So the bottom slide shows that if you have more than 8 degree heating weeks, you have a raised probability of not only coral bleaching, and we know from those of you who dive in the Maldives, for example, very big bleaching in '98, got good recovery. If you have over 8 degree heating weeks, you have a much greater likelihood of mortality. And it's not just coral mortality. You completely change the ecosystem. So this was a paper published at the end of last year, again about the 2005 mass bleaching event, which showed that you got a change in the ecosystem from corals to using the excavating sponges, which gave you algae-dominated reefs. So successive excavating sponges depended on the intensity of coral bleaching. So it's, you know, it's a complex ecosystem. You've got bleaching, might it recover? Then the excavating sponges come in, diseases come in. You know, it's a very complex ecosystem. But it's not all bad news. So this is one of the reefs that I used to dive on, Dairy Bull Reef, just north of Jamaica. There's an Acropora cervicornis, branching coral, and you can see it's almost completely killed at the top left-hand corner through the sea surface temperature rise. But when I went back just a year or two later, wonderful, vibrant Acropora cervicornis had come back. That was so exciting to see in what elsewhere was a desert. And one of the other exciting things is that's been very much retained. So this is up to 2015. We had the dip in 2006, but most of the corals at this particular reef have not only come back, but have been maintained. The question is, big question, why? Why do some reefs recover? Why do some not recover? One of the key elements, I think, is what we call rugosity. That's the three-dimensionality of the reef. The more three-dimensional it is, the more likely it is that you're going to get good recovery. It's only one of the number of variables. I'll talk about that a bit later on. But certainly when you have good rugosity, you tend to get good coral cover that is more resilient. Also, good rugosity, good three-dimensionality, also allows for more increase in small colony numbers after that major bleaching event. So mean rugosity there, more three-dimensionality, more increase in small colony numbers. In other words, the reef is going to survive more and be more resilient. So I'm going to move now to Indonesia. I'm sure you've dived in Indonesia. I know one person has certainly dived in Indonesia. Anybody else dived in India? Yes, we have some Indonesians, excellent. Just to mention, I mentioned blast fishing, and I was there in the water when a bomb went off. The cost of inaction of blast fishing has been estimated at 3.8 billion in Indonesia alone. And these figures would have justified enforcement expenditures of around 400 million annually. Now, of course, I'm very conscious that here we are, the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. I referred to Stanley Gray. Ships still think of reefs in a way that coral biologists don't think. And this was in March last year when in that coral triangle between the Philippines, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, this ship actually crashed into pristine coral reef at Raja Ampat, and that could cost up to nearly $2 million in compensation for ecosystem loss. So, ships are still very important. We need to look after the way the navigation happens. I've been working in the Wakatobi Marine National Park. When I was doing the work there, it used to be 5 days to get there, 5 days to get back. And we had our research lodge on the island of Hoga, and very close to Hoga, between two islands, Hoga and Kaladupa, there was a little village. And the village was entirely occupied by Badjo people. Now, have you ever come across the Badjo people? Badjo people, also called sea gypsies, are very prevalent in the Philippines as well as in Indonesia, and they mostly live entirely on ships. They don't go on land. Bad spirits live on the land, so that's why they don't live on the land. How can I disagree? But here, certainly in this part of Indonesia, a lot of them moved to build houses over the ocean. They wouldn't go on the islands, but they build houses over the ocean. What impact did that have? Here's a wonderful Acropora valenciensis colony at the Kaladupa site. Lots of good benthic cover. This is a really wonderful reef to dive on for anybody who used to or still does dive in the area. But just by the Sampela village, a completely different story. High sedimentation, and I think you can see why. Everything that was produced in the village just got totally dumped onto the reef. And that also altered the growth rates of the corals. It altered the morphology of the corals, whether you were a branching coral or, as you can see from the bottom, the non-branching corals too. We looked at estimated recruitment dates before 1930, and you can see the ones at Sampela Reef and to a less extent at Hoga Reef were significantly lower than at the distant Kaladupa reefs. Why do you think that was? That's a rhetorical question. In fact, it's coral mining. What the residents did in Sampela, they used to take their large crowbars and snorkel down and just dig up the corals and built their huts entirely on the corals, on the massive corals. Now, you might think, that's jolly good use of natural resources. Unfortunately, you could also think that if you get a severe climatic event in this area, you're going to severely imperil these houses. And we could talk about the Badjo people. They're wonderful people, but very, very poor. Their life expectancy was generally in the 40s. So what can we learn about coral reefs from other ecosystems? So I've been working for many years, for over 10 years now, with Fudan University in Shanghai, particularly with the major key laboratory of biodiversity there. And we published various papers together. really trying to answer the question, how do organisms adapt and evolve in extreme environments? The marine environment is very extreme, but there are other extreme environments. What can we learn? We published this paper in 2009 on increasing cooperativity of pathways under water stress and high CO2 conditions, particularly in plants. In other words, these are sort of climatic changes. The encouraging thing was that we noticed that pathways in cells actually collaborate together. It's not just organisms that can collaborate together, it's pathways in the cell that can collaborate too. More recently, we've been working on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, and also, there's Lhasa. Anybody been to Tibet? We have one, yes, very good. Lake Namso is very interesting. I'm sure you may know that the Qinghai Tibet Plateau was raised because you've got the subduction of one plate under this second plate, the rise in the Himalayas, and of course the rise of this Qinghai Tibet Plateau, the QTP. So in this lake, and it's important because the lakes are all salty, because at the time it was a marine environment, raised very, very quickly. It also has more ultraviolet radiation than any other terrestrial environment, lots of wind, snow, really it's the most extreme terrestrial environment on the planet. There's your yak. That's Lake Namso, and we identified a particular cyanobacterium, about the oldest organisms on the planet. We sequenced the genome and tried to investigate the mechanism for its adaptation. I don't have real time to go into this. It's two things, really. Firstly, it has to do with the membrane structure, which is more stable in this particular organism than in other species of this type. And secondly, and very importantly, we found lots of mycosporin-like amino acids. And that's very exciting because mycosporin-like amino acids, they have lots of conjugated rings, absorb ultraviolet radiation. They are also found in corals, and are also, we think, important in protecting corals from ultraviolet radiation. So just one illustration about how working with one environment can actually help us understand another environment. More recently, we published this paper 3 months ago. We discovered a new high-altitude ecotype of an Arabidopsis, from Tibet. Arabidopsis is a very important plant. It was the first plant. It is the model plant. We now have others, but it was the very first one, sequenced in 2000. You can't see it, but it's more early. The deviation from the common ancestor was actually before any other of the other Arabidopsis species, ecotypes that have been found elsewhere. So very exciting. We are doing lots of other work, new work in this at the moment. So I hope this particular plant will also be telling us something about how organisms can adapt and evolve in extreme environments. Let me go back to that big question. Why are reefs more resilient in some places than others? So we've been looking at a number of different rare areas, and basically there are lots of different reasons. There's not one reason. One thing which is one of the similarities, which I mentioned at the bottom, is it really comes from the idea of Franklin and colleagues developed in rainforests, the generation of a biological legacy. And that's been, I think, very well investigated by Isabelle Coté and her colleagues, a paper published just a few weeks ago in Science, showing that there is sometimes an intrinsic resistance in some corals, a sort of a natural supercoral, if you like. as well as extrinsic factors. For example, you can have cool currents coming up, and also, and I refer back to Alex Rogers' lecture last year at this time when he was talking about mesophotic reefs. Mesophotic reefs could actually act as it were, exemplaries for the genetic material, which could then go further up into what we know as photic coral reefs. So there could be an exchange between the mesophotic and the photic reefs. So that's, watch this space for that one. So lots of ways that could happen, and also there can be connectivity. And connectivity between different parts of the reef was explored in this, I think, very important paper published at the end of last year about the Great Barrier Reef. You saw earlier on almost all those northern reefs were completely bleached. Well, what Hock and colleagues did were try and identify robust sources of reefs which were not subject to what we call crown of thorns starfish, COTS outbreaks, and were also where you could get that exchange of genetic material from one reef to another. So currents are very important too. So that was a very important paper and shows ways in which the Great Barrier Reef might be able to survive if we give it the chance and if we don't pollute it with all those runoff from the insecticides, which the farmers always use just on the coastline. Big problem. And I'm sure you've read all the politics of that. But I don't want to lead you to a false sense of security, because also a few weeks ago there was this very important paper that climate change promotes parasitism in coral symbiosis. We think, perhaps naively, that actually both the polyp and the algal cell both benefit. But if you warm up the symbiotic coral, you don't get a proportional increase in the products of photosynthesis. And what was a symbiosis then becomes a parasitism, and you get the algal cell actually doing better than the polyp if you warm the water up. And that's a real problem, because it challenges the notion that assisted evolution, by putting, new engineered symbionts in, could be used to breed a superior thermal tolerant coral host. So, it's a very, very complex issue. And because it's so complex, I think it's important that we consider geoengineering as a possibility. Now, geoengineering, the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural system to counteract climate change, more or less two different types. Carbon dioxide removal, sort of thing that you get with rainforests, and I've done some work with that. I don't have time to talk about that. What I will talk about is some of our recent work on solar radiation management. So this is when you inject, for example, aerosols, particularly sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere, and you model how that might influence the sea surface temperatures. And just to cut it, this was a paper published at the end of last year between myself and Jiwa Zhong in Beijing this time. The representative concentration pathway, 4.5, which people often use, you can see we get quite a lot of rise in sea surface temperatures. If you have the geoengineering, that cuts the rise in sea surface temperature down. Interestingly, it also increases the return period of Category 5 hurricanes. So you can see the blue line there under geoengineering. It actually takes longer for the Category 5 hurricanes to return. The question is it increased enough so you get the recovery of the reef? That's the question. But again, shipping and marine ships could be very important. Could bright foamy wakes from ships combat global warming. There was a very interesting paper published a couple of years ago now showing that if you increased microbubbles in ship wakes, the blue line there is going to actually benefit the overall decrease in temperature. So increasing albedo or reflectance from existing ship wakes can reduce that increase in temperature. So, you know, we need to research all these very important methods for the future. But there's no doubt that community involvement is absolutely crucial. This is some work that I and colleagues have been doing in Jamaica. I mentioned this International Year of the Reef. There have been a number of actions, not just activity but actions. So Nature Conservancy, a particular state of Quintana Roo in Mexico, have created a Coastal Zone Management Trust. I mentioned the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, that's very important. Belize, where I've been working, announced that it will expand its no-take zones, that means no fishing, from 3% to over 10% by the end of 2018. Fiji has nominated its Great Sea Reef as what's called a Ramsar site, a very important international recognition. The Philippines have launched a good governance program. Brazil is going to create 2 new MPAs. The Seychelles has created 2 new marine park areas, marine protected areas that will increase its area under marine protection. And I think most significant of all is in the United States. And Governor Rick Scott very, very recently signed a bill that will create a coral reef conservation area off Florida's southeast coast. And when you think that a few years ago, people who were under government employ could not mention the word climate change in Florida, you know, that's quite a significant change. What about us? What can we do? Well, I mentioned the Year of the Reef. There is a very special image bank that you can go to. It's absolutely free. There have been some major international photographers who've donated pictures to it. You can go right to that reef site, that website, and download these wonderful images and, you know, show to friends and colleagues. There are also art competitions. For those of you who remember the last International Year of the Reef, there was a wonderful crocheted reef that was on display on the South Bank. Well, the Khalid bin Sultan Living Oceans Foundation want to create a piece of art open to school students. The British government have gone to children aged 4 to 17 to design an official postage stamp for British Ocean, Indian Ocean territory. The deadline is the 11th of May there. And you can also go to the Horniman Museum this month and actually work and do some displays on coral reefs. They want to highlight the value of coral reefs to marine life and to humans. In the second week, crafts will be inspired by the International Year of the Reef. So please engage to support reef awareness. As Chris was saying, I'm chair of the International Society for Reef Studies Education Committee. We're doing lots of things, as are IOR, the International Reef. Do have a look at their website. It changes almost weekly. New things, new resources, new initiatives come online. It's very exciting. So please, please do that. So that's thanks to lots of people. Thank you to the wonderful people who set all this up here, of course. Thanks to people who've sponsored me. Now is the time to help corals. As T.S. Eliot said, time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. Now is the time to help corals. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.
I'm glad to see that Professor Crabbe has a glass of water to recover himself after the exposition. Now, if I was speaking like a High Court judge, I would say, Professor Crabbe, you have done us great honour. If I was speaking as a marine scientist, I say, James, that was brilliant. I learned so much. Thank you very much. And if I was speaking as a marine engineer, which I can because I am one, I'd simply say, cool, that was good. It was outstanding. And to be a little bit more serious, what I loved was the breadth and the depth and the erudition and the fluency and the flowing nature of it. There was a lot that was going to disappoint and make us unhappy in there, because obviously what we're witnessing is a tragedy. But it's wonderful to see that we're beginning to take awareness of that, and James is in the forefront of what we're doing to understand it and therefore to counter it. So I think we, at this Stanley Gray lecture, have been really privileged to hear that. And just before we put him on the rack of questions, just one more really big round of applause for what I thought was an outstanding lecture. There are people listening on the live stream, so we have to use microphones, but now this is your chance. Stick your hand up, get your question ready. I've got a few, because of course as chairman you always have a few questions in your back pocket. The trouble was he answered most of them going through the lecture, but I've still got one or two if you dry up, but hopefully you won't. So hands up please. Who's going to start us off? Okay, we'll take you. Wait for the microphone. It's on its way.
Do we know if noise pollution is affecting reefs at all?
Yep. Excuse me. Very good question. The noise pollution is a key issue, particularly for mammals. And in terms of coral reefs, of course, that's dolphins. You saw the food web, you saw the dolphins there. So noise pollution is very, very important. And there's lots of research going on about noise pollution with mammals, with marine mammals, and of course whales also key. Humpback whales, sperm whales, also all around coral reef areas. So you make a very important point. I couldn't deal with every single problem that coral reefs and all the species that rely on them have to encounter, but you're quite right. And I know that a lot of shipping companies, and certainly the Royal Navy, in fact, are looking at that very seriously. Thank you.
There was a question over here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that very interesting lecture. I'm sure we're all a lot wiser than when we came in. So we're hearing all these sort of doomsday scenarios, and indeed we are in that situation now, but something that we're not hearing is what we can do as individuals. And is that because there's not much we can do as individuals?
There certainly is there are a number of things that we can do. And in fact, in the International Society for Reef Studies, we've actually put down a list of 10 things that people can do. So when you go out of a room, switch the lights off, things like that, simple things. Of course there are. I mean, the Berlin Wall did come down. I know that the reasons were complex and we could spend hours arguing about it, but certainly people power was very important, and it still is. That's why I put the Governor Scott thing in Florida. You know, I mean, you think of what's going on at the top level. Actually, there's an awful lot going on underneath, you know, which is very positive to climate change, which you never hear about at all. It's the mismatch between the politics and the science and people.
I had one here, there, that gentleman. Yes, please, if you could wait for the microphone.
My question, Professor Crabbe, but first of all, thank you for a wonderful talk. I am a layman, and I was learning and learning and learning. You mentioned the Great Barrier Reef, and there's been a lot of publicity about it over the last 18 months. How successful is the government of Australia and the work that is being done to try and, do we say, begin the process of restoring it back to health? Have we even got that far?
It's going worse, I'm afraid, currently. They've already reneged on so many marine protected areas. So the current government of Australia is not friendly, shall we say. Fortunately, there are a lot of very influential people working on the Great Barrier Reef, but unless you have that political buy-in, it makes things extremely difficult. You know, I go back to our statement, you know, in 2009. You know, it was a complete mismatch. You know, it's trying to get, you know, those very important lobbies that will appeal to short-termism. That's really difficult. Because coral reefs, you know, last a long time and they take a long time to recover. I'm not sure what to say. But there are good things happening. You know, that's why I mention, you know, some of the positive things about the Great Barrier Reef. That paper showing that, you know, you can get recovery. You know, some of my colleagues, I won't name names, you know, just give a complete negative picture. You know, human beings are going to die out, it's going to be the next mass extinction event on the planet, and so on and so forth. But you don't get people to engage if you go down that route. Some other colleagues go perhaps too far the other way. So it's maintaining that balance, that evidence base, which is so important.
Okay, before we go to the question I've got primed at the front, Daniel, is that a live stream question coming in or something?
Yes, it is. We've got a virtual room as well watching. So I've got, if I may, just a couple of questions that have come in. One viewer asks, how long can coral survive after it bleaches?
Sorry, how long will it survive?
Yeah.
Okay.
If it does, I guess.
Yes, I mean, it all depends on what else is going on. So as I said, in the Maldives, for those who were diving in the Maldives in the 90s, particularly after the 98 bleaching event, you know, that was very difficult. But they largely subsequently came back pretty strongly. And it all has to do with not only the number of degree heating weeks that they have, but also what else is going on. Do you get divers walking on the reefs? Do you get pollution from all the pesticides that you get run off down the Burdekin River onto the Great Barrier Reef, for example? So, you know, how long is a piece of string? I know that's a cop-out answer. They can recover quickly, and that's why I also show the picture that I took in Dairy Bull Reef in Jamaica. You know, from almost no viable branching coral whatever, you know, in a couple of years you're back to really vibrant reefs. So a lot depends on what else is going on.
Great, thank you. And one more question, if I may. What technologies are on your wish list for helping understand coral health and helping with coral conservation?
Okay, I'm going to answer that by posing another question. Do we really need more research on coral reefs? Do we really need to have more monitoring? We know what the problems are. We need to solve them. It's, you know, of course we love to do research and we find things out, and the recent research that I've spoken about. But actually it needs to move to another forum altogether. It needs to move to political, to economic, where people, you know, just going by at the Tower of London will cry if the coral reefs are not going to survive. You know, you need that public understanding. That's why the International Year of the Reef is actually important.
Okay, sir, thank you for being so patient.
Also, James, I've been aware of your incredible efforts for coral over many years, and we all owe you a massive debt. There's no question about that. You've also made things very clear to us tonight. mindful of ocean system inertia and the fact that we have decades to play out before the true impacts of even current CO2 levels present in the oceans, which is a big problem for reefs, which is often hard to understand from policymaker perspective. It really does bring us back to the question, I think, of geoengineering and trying to buy time and get our hand away from that campfire so we're not causing too much damage. And I'd just be nice to know your view in terms of the imperative for that, because that's a sensitive issue for policy, and how do we communicate it if we want these systems to be viable entities looking to into the future. How significant a kind of critical role does geoengineering have, and how might that play out?
I think it's absolutely critical that we know more. I mean, we know what's happening with corals. We don't know how geoengineering might play out, either in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the ocean. You know, that's why, I mean, our paper published at the end of last year was the very first paper on coral reefs for geoengineering on coral reefs. So we need to know a lot more about it. So coming back to the technology question, which is relevant to your very good question, you know, that's where the research needs to go. We need to know more about that. We need to know more about carbon capture. You know, who would do geoengineering in their right minds if we weren't in such a dire situation? Of course you wouldn't. You know, it's crazy. You know, putting things to limit the sun, you know, that's what happens when volcanoes explode in Mount Pinatubo, things like that. Of course, you wouldn't normally do it, but we are not in that logical, rational position. That's why we need to make evidence-based decisions based on a lot of very good research. So that's where the research needs to go. Obviously, carbon capture and storage is the natural or more natural alternatives to putting things up in the stratosphere. So increasing, you know, the trees, the afforestation is obviously, you know, it's a no-brainer. We need to do more of that. But you can't just take the areas that have been completely flattened in Indonesia. You know, I mean, I have seen forests just disappear as I go past on the Pelny ferry. You can't take those areas and just suddenly plant trees. It just doesn't happen. All the topsoil's gone. The whole ecosystem has completely changed. It needs, you know, much more sensitive work than just planting trees. You know, we need to do much more knowledge about forest ecosystems and not having monocultures like in reef. So there's a lot that we need to do. But, you know, geoengineering could be very, very important. Shipping, absolutely vital potentially for marine cloud brightening.
I was wondering, can we look back, you know, hundreds of thousands of years and see what's happened to corals in the past as the Earth has warmed up and cooled? Is that possible?
You certainly can. Corals are wonderful proxies for climate change. I didn't go into any of the geology, but there have been corals, different corals have been around for a very, very long time. Not quite as long as the cyanobacteria, but certainly for a long time. And the corals that we have now are very different types of species to the ones that were around then. Of course, you have knowledge of carbon dioxide changes. We've had greater concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know all these things. It's a very good question because it produces that very important chronological picture. The issue is, well, it's twofold really. First of all, things that weren't around when there were very high things, mankind wasn't here then. You know, mankind is the big issue, and there are an awful lot of us, and we're not getting any fewer. So that's one big issue. The other issue is of course that that we have different ways of dealing with the greenhouse gases. Now, we know much more about greenhouse gases, and every time that we look, for example, into samples, either it's of ice or tundra, why didn't you look at this? So we have to go back and look at all these things. But there was a paper, I saw it only today, that actually snowfall has increased in the Antarctic. I don't know if anybody saw that. It was, we're in a very fluid environment, tectonic plates are moving. That's very important to recognize. We need to have that knowledge, but we also need to be very clear that the people are the elephant in the room.
I think, who was next? Did you have someone in mind? No? I think person at the back and then you. Okay. Sorry, I've missed you. I knew I had someone else in the queue. Right, person at the back first, then you, then you. Sorry.
How do you feel about active reef restoration? Do you think it's worthwhile at the moment? Or do you think our efforts are better spent on trying to mitigate the impacts?
Okay, well, the more we can do, the better. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't have time really to go into that. Active reef restoration is when you try and develop coral nurseries and put them back in the ocean environment, in open water. And I have come across a bit of that. There are problems. You can't just grow corals in your little nursery, in your tank, then transport them out into open water and expect them to then grow, because the first storm that comes along will just smash them into little pieces. So it needs to be much more nuanced than that, much more carefully done. And it can be done. It can be done. The evidence is not there. I've seen lots and lots of coral nurseries. I haven't seen much evidence of this wonderful extant coral reef that has been produced because the nursery corals have gone out there. And also there's a great danger of getting the monoculture again. Very difficult. It's a complex issue. But there are a lot of people working on it, and particularly if you can then make the super corals. But as I showed from that research, that could be a problem.
Okay.
I feel like a lone voice in the wind here, because I'm a marine engineer, been in marine engineering in the widest sense since about 1958 until I was retired in 2012. And this institute is one of my few links since then. And in particular, the 4 or 3 prestige lectures which it provides now. In 1969, when I started, there was 10 or 12 a year. And I come here irrespective of the subject. And it was quite bewildering. But I did raise, right at the beginning, one question and one almost at the end. You said it is affecting or will affect millions of people. The thing that I could see was that the deterioration of the coral, the fish, or marine life, is going down, so that will affect tremendously the fish and the food and the people involved in all of that. Is that the main one, or the only one, or what else is affecting the millions of people? And I'll throw the second question now while I remember it. Almost at the end, you talked about ship's wake bubbles.
Yep.
Now, bubbles are, what do you say, anathema to marine engineers, because bubbles on the propeller are the death of the propeller. Cavitation, efficiency, propulsion, cost taking more energy to move a ship. So is that a war between two sort of disciplines?
Sure. Let me come to your second question first. And I think it's a bit like the hurricanes. Hurricanes are, of course, extremely bad in many ways, but they do cool water down. And I think what the research indicated that I mentioned is that the possibility, other things being equal, is that the marine cloud brightening from from ships' wakes with microbubbles could actually be helpful. Now, what you've raised very importantly is that we need to look at the whole picture. You know, we need to look at the energy consumption, we need to look at the cavitation of the propellers, you know, we need to look at the negatives as well as the positives and work out what the balance is going to be. You know, and that's very, very important. Your first question, which I've forgotten, I'm afraid.
The millions of people.
Okay, right. Yeah, sure. Okay. Obviously, it's going to affect the fishermen first. Only yesterday, I mean, I mentioned Jamaica. A big issue is parrotfish. Now, I haven't had time to tell you why parrotfish are important. Parrotfish are crucial to keeping the reef clean and to making sure you don't get that sort of macroalgal mess, which I showed you on at least one of the pictures. Unfortunately, parrotfish actually taste very nice. And certainly in Jamaica, and as well as elsewhere in the Caribbean, seafood restaurants often always have really, parrotfish to eat. And of course, if you're a fisherman, if you're a restaurateur or a consumer, you don't want to suddenly lose your favorite fish. So what do? So there is an answer. And the answer comes from invasive species. Now, I haven't had time to talk about invasive species, but there is a big problem of invasive species in the Caribbean through lionfish. Lionfish are very predatory fish. You don't want to touch one. They're very harmful spikes, very poisonous. But they are apparently, unfortunately I haven't eaten one, but they're very good to eat. So there is a move in Jamaica to replace the parrotfish by lionfish. Now, that has reached a sort of a full stop really at the moment, because there isn't a concerted effort on behalf of the National Protection Agency, the Environmental Agency, on exactly what to do. We do need more research linking people. So social science, I mean, you asked for technology, it's the social science that we need on linking people to how people can actually help in order to get us to where we want to be. And they can, you know, people have lots of ideas. I've said they're the elephant in the room, but also they're the source of ideas for the future. So we do need to do a lot more with them in order to go right round from, I'm sorry.
No, I'll move it towards you.
Thank you. In order, well, so I can see. So in order to move to all the agencies, including ourselves in the West, who rely on the coral reefs.
Coastal protection, James, must be a really big factor affecting many millions of people, whole cities, etc. Coastal protection.
Okay, so just for the distant few, the gentleman at the front mentioned coastal protection as being very important. Absolutely true. And what we do know is there's no good in just protecting a small area. The areas have to be big. Just protecting one little MPA, marine protected area, isn't going to be very effective. We need big areas, unfortunately.
Okay, we have another question on the live room, but we're going to leave that because there's a lady waiting here patiently, so they'll just wait one turn, if I get this right, and you get the prize for being the most patient.
Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture. Very, very interesting and very motivating as well for us to take action. So I'm actually studying coral reefs here, and then I would like to know your point of view now that we are in this desperation to try to save them somehow. What is your perspective on the genetic engineering measurements or studies that are being now taking over, let's say, a big part of the research budget for coral reefs?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to see it. I mean, I would like to see a lot more research exactly on geoengineering, on both carbon capture and storage, as well as on solar radiation management. But also I'd like to see much more on the governance issues. There have been some papers showing that if we have solar radiation management, there are going to be winners and losers. And I think it's important to recognize that that could well be, so that some parts of the world are going to benefit, other parts of the world may not benefit. But we need to know that. We need to have the research, and we need to have the social science and the economics laid out and made transparent. And that's very, very important.
Over in question, Daniel.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to everyone online who's been asking questions. There are quite a few, but I'll just do one, if that's okay. This comes from, I believe, a room of students at a German university who are currently tuned in and watching.
Lovely, thank you very much.
It touches on geoengineering as well, but how would one seriously do an impact assessment of processes at the scale of geoengineering? Do we really have the tools? Do we have the tools to work out whether we wouldn't be doing more harm than good?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. As I said, you wouldn't, in normal circumstances, think of geoengineering as an option. The paper that I referred to towards the end, on, I think it was to the end, on ocean acidification, that had only just been published in Nature, was the first actual paper to show that if you take a real large marine environment, you were going to compromise the ecosystem by having an increased amount of carbon dioxide there. Now, people have been arguing about that for actually a long time. I mean, it's had its proponents and it's people who don't think it's very good. That's why that was such an important paper. We need that with geoengineering, but we're not at the stage yet of even getting there, it seems to me. We need to have much more modelling and much science and social science and governance research on actually what's going to happen. I mean, we have an awful lot of computing power at our disposal. As colleagues may know, the biggest use of computing power in the world is always by the military. But number two are the meteorologists. And, you know, there's an awful lot of computing power there, an awful lot of great modelling that's going on around the world. So we need to capture that and to make sure that research is funded in all these very important areas.
Okay, we're now coming to our last two questions, I'm afraid. First one's here, I think, and then you, sir.
Just a quick question about another problem, but that it may be more for us individual, and that is the plastic pollution.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the microplastic.
Yes, yes.
I know it's done a lot of research how much is picked up by fish and how much, but nearly every living creature has plastic in it, and that stays in the water for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And we are nowhere close to get a stop on it. So please.
Very good. I mean, short questions often can lead to very long answers. That's the problem. But it's a very good example of how the media and all of us talking about plastics, whatever you like to call it, has greatly increased, the public understanding of plastic. And everybody refers to it, whether you're the Prince of Wales, whether you're Ruth Gates or the president of this, that, or the other. We do know about plastics now. We also know that they are very important, not just for one aspect of the marine environment. They're important for coral reefs, they're important for all the organisms in the marine environment. So that's key. You need the big picture. But you also need everybody engaged, and that's why I'd like to see, International Year of the Reef doing that.
Thank you. And our final question, sir.
examples of the studies that you've done with regard to bleaching. I think you mentioned early on at the beginning of your talk about the Arabian Gulf, and then there's the Great Barrier Reef, the Caribbean and Southeast Asia and so on. I spent many years in the Middle East, in Jeddah, and I mean that's got a wonderful reef. I did a bit of snorkeling. I couldn't believe what I saw. I just couldn't believe it. This was in the 80s.
Yeah.
So the question is, you know, warm water, very warm water temperature.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, are there different species of coral that can resist, you know, inherently warm water?
Yes.
And if so, perhaps they're not, you know, they're not having a problem over bleaching.
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, what has happened in the Persian Gulf, let's forget Dubai, please, forget Dubai. Forget all the oil wells. What you describe is something that has been happening over a very, very long period of time. It's actually quite a shallow ocean, the Persian Gulf. It's very warm and it's developed its reefs over a long period of time. You are quite right in that the corals that can survive there survive hotter than anywhere else that we know about, apart from the odd rock pool. And they've done that by evolving over a long period of time. It's not the coral animals, as far as we know, which contains all the key biosynthetic mechanism to do that. It's in the symbiotic algae that mean you're not going to be expelled if the temperatures go up. And there's lots of genetic engineering currently going on the different types of symbiotic algae, and that we know are different. So in fact, clade D is a particular type of symbiotic algae, which is very thermotolerant. And there's a lot of clade D in corals in the Persian Gulf, which you would expect, and they've evolved over time. So that's good news. But what was interesting was then the other paper I showed from just a few weeks ago, that if you take other parts of the world and you rise the temperatures, then the algae can themselves become parasitic. So you've gone from a symbiotic relationship to a very negative one, which means the corals have to rely much more on feeding rather than the energy that comes from the sunlight and from the algae. My point really, to answer your question, to get to the Persian Gulf state, to get to those corals, took an awful lot of time and a lot of mutation and a lot of genetics and gene work.
Stand about here so I can get to the microphone. And now we come to the thank yous. And the first people I want to thank are the people receiving this through the live stream and for offering their questions. That shows it can be done and done well, so thank you very much. And then secondly, of course, for you, the audience. I think you've been exemplary and you've engaged brilliantly, and I think you've certainly earned your glass of wine. I recommend you stay long enough to drink several of them. The next person to kick me on the way out is, of course, the Chief Executive, but I'll try and avoid him. And then, of course, we have to thank Professor James Crabbe. Now, I'll say it for real now. Professor Crabbe, you have done us great honour. Thank you very, very much. You can be proud of what you've done, and we are delighted to have been here for it. Now, because of that, I'm delighted to give you a small memento of the evening to you.
Thank you.
Don't share it with anyone here, right? And make sure you enjoy it.
Thank you very much.